we're actually at the edge of the Hudson Valley.
Mm.
So from where we are, you when you drive east, you end up in the Hudson River. If you go far enough, or excuse me, far enough west, you end up in the Hudson River. And if you go about 5 miles west, you end up in Massachusetts. So we're at that boundary between New England and the Hudson Valley, which
Yeah.
is its own kind of micro um, cultural geography as well as ecosystem. Yeah,
Yeah. And it's very beautiful. I used to live in New York City, and I would go up every once in a while. It's hard to leave a city, but when every once in a while I would go up the Hudson Valley to see some of the fall, the leaves changing and things
sure.
like that. There's really nothing quite like it. Uh,
Yeah, it's gorgeous.
how and I know that the actual facility, or like the Tendai Buddhist Institute's grounds
Uh-huh.
are that of what seems like it was a formerly a farm, or like a has
It
a
was a
barn.
dairy. It was a dairy farm.
Wow.
So originally it was 132, 132 acres, and we have 110 acres now. And the background that you see is the interior of our Hondo, which would be the interior of the main building or the temple. And that was a 250-year-old horse barn when we took it down 20 years ago. 20 years ago, at this time, we were rebuilding this building the background you see behind me.
Wow.
And so we had two barns, a dairy barn and a horse barn, as well as what is now a 200-year-old house and a number of outbuildings, chicken coops and that kind of stuff. So that was, and in a very real way, one of the reasons that the property chose us and we chose it is because it's what is referred to as a double dragon in feng shui. In Japanese feng shui, it's resided in the notch between two mountains, so the dragons are on either side, and then there's a stream that runs down to carry the energy. So
Wow.
the location is very auspicious, and it's the sort of location in Japan that you would locate a temple.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, I'm so this is such a wonderful thing to hear. Just the fact that there's just even outside of it being in this elevated between the Hudson Valley and Massachusetts line, and having the this beautiful foliage that turns a beautiful color in the autumn, and not to mention all of the other wonderful seasons that you get.
Mhm.
You're also just in this in between two dragons with a stream.
It's one of the reasons it is the prime, well, several reasons, but that's one of the main reasons we chose this place. When Shumon and I, my wife, when we moved back from Japan approximately 30 years ago, or 20, yeah, 30 years, 25 years ago now, the we could have moved any place in the country. And so it really came down to its proximity to New York City and Boston, and the triangle between New York City, Albany, and Boston has one of the largest Buddhist populations in the United States, comparable to that between San Francisco and LA.
Wow.
And so demographics is one of the reasons we chose the area. But then we chose the area because we said, where do we want to live that other people go to relax?
And that way you can have a little bit of that too on a
We
regular
can we
basis.
can sort of get it. And since we're having this sort of free-form discussion, I think that that's one of the differences between Japanese Buddhism and Tibetan Buddhism. Tibetan Buddhism, you have those magnificent mountains, those peaks, those, snow-covered places, and it's so dramatic, and you see it also that they have such incredible, colorful costumes and colorful events, and all of that sort of thing. And to me, the Himalaya mountains represent raw energy. And whereas, so Tibetan Buddhism, I think, has that raw energy, and that not I don't mean that in a pejorative way. I mean it in a very positive way. But Japanese Buddhism is, it also has dramatic mountains and sacred mountains, etc. But they're all settled. it has this feeling of more serenity. It's not raw energy, it's more settled energy. And
Mm.
so one of the reasons we chose where we are is because that's what this area represents. Many people don't know we're at the where the Taconic Mountains and the Berkshire Mountains come together, and there was a tectonic plate that separated what is New England from the rest of North America. It was originally part of Europe, and so when those clashed, they came in. That was, obviously hundreds of millions of years ago, and when that happened, I think it brought with it the mountains here were actually among the tallest mountains in the world at that time, taller than the Himalayas are today. And so the Berkshire Hills and the Taconic Hills are now so subdued because hundreds of millions of years ago, they were that raw energy that the Himalayas are today. And so I
Wow.
think in some ways when people are making a choice, am I more interested in Tibetan Buddhism or am I more interested in Japanese or Korean or Chinese, whatever it happens to be, South Asian Buddhism? I think that intuitively, though not necessarily consciously, that's one of the things that attracts people to one compared to another, is just that kind of distinction.
And that kind of association with an energy, like so someone might
Yeah,
be um more drawn to the raw energy of a Tibetan Buddhism, or like that aesthetic
right.
of the Himalayas.
Yeah.
Uh, well, that's a fascinating geographic history of where you are. That it's and did that all did was that kind of something that you realized when you had moved there and started to kind of get to know more about the area, or was that part of your decision making?
Well, actually, we were trying to replicate somewhat what Mount Hiei, the Center for Tendai Buddhism in Japan, where because that's what you get on Mount Hiei also, even though Mount Hiei is much higher peaks than we're at here, but it has some of that same feeling. And so we were trying to replicate what you get at Mount Hiei. I mean, we easily could have gone to Boston or New York or any major city, but we specifically went to this area because it represented a kind of replication of the feel, not necessarily mimicry, but a replication of the feel of those areas. So that in the morning during certain times of the year, you have, I look out and I see the mist that's hanging in the hills on either side of us, and you have that same sort of feeling on Hiezan. The differences on Hiezan when you look down the mountain. If you're from the places that priests would stay in near the top of the mountain, the only difference is you think to yourself, oh, this is the path that Saicho, the founder of Tendai Buddhism in Japan, that path is the path that Saicho walked on. And when you go out to get the purification water in the morning, you're going to the same spring that Saicho went to get the purification water. You can't replicate that, but you can certainly at least find that the environment that you're in, that you're surrounded by, has that kind of energy to it.
Yeah. Well, that is a really wonderful quality to the physical manifestation of the Tendai Buddhist Institute, where you're replicating that feel, and that is a maybe an element that you more or less can control in the sense of where you set your roots,
Right.
but you can't model and replicate every little
Right.
historical
Nor nor
meaning.
would we want to because, Hiezon is unique. That's
Yeah.
you're not going to, otherwise it becomes mimicry and cultural appropriation. You don't want to do that.
Yeah. And what were your experiences like going to Mount Hiei? Because I know that it's a central and fundamental core component of Tendai, and I was just curious if you had a relation, and it has a foundation in the mountainness. Like there's a reason
Right.
why the mountain itself is important. Did you feel that when you got there, or did you kind of more so after maybe having some spent more time there, hearing more about the energy of the mountain, did it start to kind of come to a more articulate place?
Well, I'll tell you if we have the time to do it, if you don't mind, I'll tell you
Please.
an interesting little vignette because the very first time that I went to Mount Hiei was my wife Tamami, who's Japanese, and I had been in graduate school, and we went to Japan so that I would meet her parents, not knowing that they had already planned a wedding for us when we got there. Um, but which we did get married. But before we actually had the wedding, I was visiting some of her relatives that were in Otsu, which is at the bottom of Mount Hiei, and that's the city at the base of Mount Hiei. And so on New Year's Eve, it's traditional to go to Buddhist temples on New Year's Eve. And so one of her uncles gave me a choice. Where would you like to go? And he gave me a choice of, four different places to go for New Year's Eve. And it was a car full of people was going to go. And that year, the weather was just horrendous. In Otsu itself, it was rainy and cold and, etc. But I said, one of the choices was, would you like to go to the top of Mount Hiei and be there for New Year's and ring the gong and that sort of thing. Now, I had been a Zen practitioner up until that point for 20 plus years. And I knew only from footnotes about Tendai. I hadn't studied it. And remember, this is back in the 1980s. And so I said, well, yeah, let's go to Hiei. That would be great, to be at the top of this famous mountain and at New Year's. And so going up the mountain is really treacherous. I mean, there are switchbacks that you have to pull off the road for other cars to go past and that sort of thing. In the middle of this ice storm, we're going up the mountain and, and just incredible. We got up there and we did all the things we wanted to do up there. It was a terrible, weather-wise, it was just a terrible night, but otherwise it was beautiful to be there and celebrate with the thousands of people who would be on top of the mountain at that time. So I had no idea that, you go now another 4 years. Now I find myself living in Japan. I find myself meeting my teacher, Ichishima Sensei, who's Tendai, going to Taisho University, Taisho Daigaku, for 3 years to get more graduate studies now in Buddhism and Asian studies. My other degree is in biomedical anthropology, totally different. And now I go to Hiei, for various things as I was training and eventually did my full gyo. I did part of my gyo with my teacher, Ichishima Sensei. A gyo is the training period. So I'd been studying at Taisho Daigaku for 3+ years, and then after that studied with him to do what's called Shido Kegyo, which is the esoteric portion, the Mikyo portion. And then I find myself doing the Zengyo portion years later. And I have to think back to what caused me to go to Hiei that first time. That was, what that would have been? That would have been 6 years before I took ordination, 6 or 7 years before I took ordination. So I think about that. I think about how life really is karmic, and how we find ourselves is sort of an interesting journey in and of itself. Yeah.
Certainly.
I didn't mean to get too far off the thing, but
No, no,
that was a,
that's a wonderful story, and no,
yeah.
and any of those stories that are details that you have are very much welcome. And it's
And
just
just to finish the question you asked, so when I found myself there the first time, I'd been living in Japan. I lived in Japan for about 6 years and did my training during that period of time, and as well as research for my professional work. But I think going up there the next time when it was not terrible weather and I had to worry about whether I was going to live going down the mountain, having gotten up there, it was such a feeling of, now I feel like I've really come home. Before I was sort of a voyeur, but now I belong here. Because by the time I'd gone to Hiei, I hadn't been ordained yet the next time I'd been to Hiei, but I was studying Tendaishu at that point. And so it had a very different feeling. And so it did feel there's a sense of sacrality that was evident just by walking along the same paths that all those other monks have walked along.
Yeah. So wow, that's an amazing quality too, where you have this sense of like a homecoming or just some sort of like deeper connection, like something a little bit more maybe maybe feeling seen or feeling a little bit more connected and rooted in something
Mhm.
like that. And then yeah, it is interesting, here or I guess then you could look back after 6 years of this experience, living in and training in Japan, and this developed connection you have to Mount Hiei, and then you think about that first time you were there, and what kind of meaning that was, and what karmically might have drawn you to in an ice storm to
Right.
to
Do
going up
that.
it. And then also too, it's just so funny that this car full of people were like, "Oh, hey, thanks for picking this one." Thanks for picking.
I'm not sure that was in their minds.
There's perfectly good one 20 minutes down the road, but let's do this.
They were
Um,
probably thinking Henegajin, a great, crazy foreigner.
yeah. No, that's all wonderful. And then just to go back into those kind of beginnings of the relationship with Mount Hiei, you had mentioned that you were a Zen practitioner, or that was part of your practice.
Right.
How did that develop? How did your Zen practice develop prior to
Oh, that started relatively early, not because I was interested in Buddhism per se, but we're talking about middle school.
mm,
And I was just in a public library, just studying one afternoon after school, and and I was wandering the stacks, probably trying to ignore whatever I was supposed to be doing, and I came across a book that just sort of jumped out at me, which was Lao Tzu's Tao Te Ching, and I thought, Tao Te Ching, what the heck is that about, right? That doesn't I don't recognize anything in that title by Lao Tzu. And so I read that and I got started on that. And the next thing you know, I'm reading the I Ching. And then after that, I'm going on to Motsu and, other Chinese. And that then led me to uh, early Buddhism in China by the time I was in high school. And then when I was I started college in 1967. And so in 1967, there was a Zen monk who was at Northeastern University, which is where I started, at Northeastern University, who was there, but this was during the Vietnamese War, and who was there as a scholar, peace scholar, quote unquote, peace scholar, whatever that meant. And interestingly enough, he didn't speak any English. I had no idea how he was supposed to bring peace other than through his very presence. But he was a Soto Zen monk. And so for some reason, I got interested in sitting with him every morning at 5 o'clock meditation. And if you remember your college years, not the typical thing that a college student was going to do. Um, and we would sit meditation for 45 minutes, an hour, and then we would just have tea, and then we'd go about our business. And I did this for the first year. And that led me to then Zen Buddhism through that contact. And like I say, he couldn't speak any English, and I couldn't speak any Japanese. So it was really just the practice. And I eventually, without going through the whole thing, I had explored other areas of Buddhism, including Tibetan and Pure Land, et cetera, et cetera. And I was more of the mind of Zen, both Rinzai and Soto Zen, and ended up eventually studying at Zen Mountain Monastery. Daido Lori, the founder of it, was still alive then. We became friends, and I had some relationship with him. And so I recognized, well, let me rephrase that. We have to keep in mind that that was a Western formulated version of Buddhism. And, by that particular lineage was founded by Maezumi Roshi. And it wasn't until I was in Japan years later and going to different Zen temples that I realized how different American Zen is compared to Japanese Zen. Part of it is adaptation, and part of it, I think, is because the founders of Zen in America, Suzuki Roshi and Maizumi Roshi and others. I'm of the opinion, I don't mean this in a pejorative fashion, but I think that their perspective was these Americans aren't really going to get what we're trying to say, so we've got to simplify it. And I think they were successful in what they did. On the other hand, I think it sort of led Zen off into a different direction than a Japanese Zen. In some ways that may be good, but in other ways I think it's not good. And so I had been satisfied being a Zen practitioner, but continually thinking in the back of my mind, there's got to be something more than this, you know? And if I was having a difficulty, you know, personal or whatever, and or just with the practice, you know, difficulty with the practice, and I went to somebody and I said, I'm not really sure how to deal with this. The answer was always, well, you just haven't been sitting long enough or hard enough, or you know, you need to buckle under and you know. So, and I had a feeling that there was something more than that. And I'm by my nature, I'm more of a scholastic to begin with. And so while there was material available beginning in the 1980s, there still wasn't the kind of material that we have available today, but you had some material. And so when in Japan I encountered Tendai, I just said, oh, this is the other stuff. This is what I was missing out. I knew there was something else, but I wasn't sure what it was. This is it, you know, because you know, the Tendai practice is really, there's not just one practice, there's practices. And in Zen, it's really sit, and if you're Soto Zen, sit, and if you need more, sit longer. And in the Rinzai, which does have a bit more scholasticism involved in it, there was a little bit more that was offered. I mean, I attended materials sessions at Daibozatsu Zendo in the Catskill Mountains, for instance, which is a Rinzai temple, which is affiliated with Japan. So it tended to be a little bit more, less of American macho Zen and a little bit more of Japanese Rinzai Zen. But when I found Tendai, I realized that that was answering the question I had, what else is there? And part of that was because I had an opportunity studying at Taisho University. My teacher, Ichishima Sensei, literally, I met him like on a Tuesday night at a meditation session and started Taisho University the next day. I dropped everything else I was doing and just, he enrolled me. So I walked into Taisho University at 2 p.m. and met the president of Taisho University, had my picture taken, signed up, attended a class, and walked out of there at, you know, 4:30 or whenever it was, as a member of Taisho University. And so it was really just that quick. And that's when I began studying Tendai, and that was, you know, now about 35 years ago.
Wow. Wow. And there's a lot there that I'm interested in learning more about, but one of them was just like when you were, because I know that when you are more or less established and committed into a practice like Zen, and you were friends with uh,
Daido Lori,
Daido Lori,
yeah.
and you were more or less plugged into sanghas and all of that. Uh, what was it like to change? I mean, was that a painful process to kind of drop the Zen element of your life, like in the way that it was, where it was more like of a committed singular thing,
Yeah.
or did it feel like, oh, well, I'm not losing anything. I'm actually
No,
adding.
I found it liberative.
Mm,
And as a matter of fact, I would suggest that when I part of being in Japan, I was there originally. I wasn't there to study Buddhism. I was there to do research and you know in my field. And I was affiliated with the University of Tokyo. And so I was going to the University of Tokyo to do my research. Then I was going to Taisho University to study, and then to make money, I was teaching at another college. You know, it was a full-time occupation. But in the last 2.5 years, almost 3 years, we lived at one of Ichishima Sensei's family's temples and directed that temple. One of the things that I was missing that I didn't realize until having lived at the temple was what I was missing was Sangha. Americans do a really good job with instilling the idea of the of Buddha nature and the Buddha resides within, and the idea of the Buddha. They do a good job, I think, of the Dharma, of teaching of the Dharma as, how to live your life in many ways. I think what we don't do such a good job of is Sangha. And so one of the things I noticed at Zen Mountain Monastery, I would attend the various events there, but at the time I was living in Albany, New York. And so it's about an hour and not quite 2 hours to Zen Mountain Monastery from Albany, about an hour 45, something like that. And I felt that when I was at Zen Mountain Monastery, everything was good. It was cool. I enjoyed studying and to sit meditation with people, and you felt connected. But then in the Albany group of people who were members of Zen Mountain Monastery, and then we'd get together and meditate one night a week. It was a Thursday or Wednesday, I don't remember. But you would show up at the place, and this was in somebody's home, somebody's office, whatever, because they don't have a formal meeting place in Albany. And you would say, "Oh, hi Bill, hi Mary," and you go and you do a little bit of ritual, and then you sit meditation, and an hour later you'd get up and you would sort of dust off, and you'd be on your way and say, "See you next week." That was it, right? Because everything was focused on the sitting, not on the relationships. Now, living at that small little temple in a village called Matsuzaki in rural Japan, it's about an hour and a half, 2 hour commuter train ride outside of Tokyo in Chiba. To get to the temple, you had to cross a rice paddy, no matter how you got to it, no matter from which direction. And it was on a little hill in the middle of these rice paddies and orchards and daikon groves and things like that. And that's when I learned about Sangha, being with the people every day. And when Shumon and my wife and I would come home from being in Tokyo, wouldn't be at the same time, we'd be commuting. And there would always be vegetables sitting outside for us to, the villagers we were the temple. So they just brought the daikon or the peaches or the apples or the cabbages or whatever it happened to be. There'd always be some vegetables or fruit waiting for us that we would then put on the altar as an offering and then later consume. And literally every day there would be people from the community there using the temple as a central location. It was a place where the local public health people might have a blood pressure clinic, or if there was a discussion to be had about a new sewer system or something, that's where they would meet. And so the temple was really the center of community activities in many ways. Not to say there weren't schools and other places they could hold things, but in that village, that happened to be the spot. And the relationships between the people went back literally millennia, not tens of years, but millennia. When you went to the cemetery that was associated with the temple, the family's tomb, because it's not to an individual, it's a family, and their ashes are placed underneath it. The individual's ashes are placed underneath it, but it's for the family. So Suzuki, let's say, those tombs and those plots are being maintained, have been maintained for 1,000 years or whatever it happens to be. And the temple itself is now about 900 years old, so that gives you an idea. And the relationships between the people were part of their Buddhism. That wasn't ancillary. It wasn't just because they lived in the same village. There was certainly that element to it. But they had a relationship because of the temple that they wouldn't have had if there was no temple there, you know. And so I never intended to be a Buddhist priest. I mean, I had to be a priest to study Shido Kegyo, which is the esoteric teachings. And so I took ordination just to do that, not to be a priest. My intention was to remain an academic. But now you're in that environment, and all of a sudden they're looking to you to say, okay, we've got to do this. Or there would be a funeral in the one of the families in the village. There were about 200 families that belonged to that small temple. There would be a funeral in the village, and at first I would, you know, Ichishima Sensei was authorized to do it. I certainly at that point, I had taken Tokuda, I'd taken ordination by then, but I didn't know sufficiently. But all of a sudden they're saying, no, 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 you have to attend. You know, I'd get a call from Ichishima Sensei and say, Suzuki-san died last night, and you know, meet me at such and such. We're going to go to their house to do the funeral. You know, and that's how I learned to do funerals, etc. Was just on that basis. But the point I'm making is that's what we're missing in the States. Was that sense of not just congregation. As a matter of fact, it was something I was talking about last week. Is that a congregation is a little bit different than a sangha, because a sangha is also a place of comfort. It's a place of protection. It's a place of mutual assistance to each other. Now, certainly many congregations may do that, Jewish or Christian or whatever congregations, they may do it to a certain extent, but that's actually one of the functions of a sangha. And that's why Shakyamuni Buddha said the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha. He didn't say the Buddha, the Dharma, let's get together. The Sangha was as much part of that refuge. What does it mean to take refuge? It means to take comfort in, to take solace, to be protected from the outside. That's the Sangha. And so when Shumon and I started Tendai Buddhist Institute, it was that in mind. What do we do that is a little bit different? Not because we need to be different, but what characterizes Tendai as opposed to other very, very fine, organizations like Zen Mountain Monastery or Daibuzatsu Zendo. We dedicate ourselves to Sangha. And so as a result, interestingly enough, within this small little community that we live in, the town of Canaan, we're in East Chatham, town of Canaan, I've done a funeral, a memorial service, or a wedding for almost all of the leaders of the town. They may be congregational Christians or Jewish, but I've done the memorials, funerals, and weddings for virtually, I think there's only one person on the town board that I haven't done something for. And so we're really part of the community. And not to say that all the people who come here are part of Canaan. Some people drive an hour to get here. They're from southern Vermont or from the other side of Albany or near Saratoga, New York, which is about an hour away. But that idea of Sangha as an essential aspect of Buddhism, not an addendum to Buddhism, but an essential aspect of Buddhism, I think is what, to a very large extent, we've been missing. It's not to say that Shambhala, for instance, had programs for kids and for families and other organizations, but I think that that's one of the things that is part of the glue that holds us together. I'm
Certainly.
sorry to pontificate like that.
That was all wonderful. I think that there's something very I'm very glad to hear that you had this experience where you finally, you had experienced a lot of the American manifestations of Buddhism, which more or less were maybe led by white Buddhist converts or otherwise, and then you finally go to Japan and you connect with a very fundamental part of Buddhism, one of the three refuges, and you see it in action, and you get to experience it where it wasn't get handed to you in a book or anything. It was handed to you in offerings of fruits and vegetables from maybe people you didn't even see pass by that day. And then
Right.
you are your temple is fed by it in the way that it is consumed by the temple, but then you also consume it as just your as life sustenance. And you are you had this chance to be fully integrated into the community through your teacher and through these processes like funerals and things like that. No, it's all extremely meaningful. And then the the application of that type of connection, or like trying to bring that connection into what the Tendai Buddhist Institute does in Canaan, in the town of Canaan, is that's also amazing too. And what was that like, where you're trying to have, because the temple that you were serving before has a 900-year history, maybe a little bit more here around the
Right.
sides. Um, and you're this is a relative to that pretty new
It's
thing.
absolutely, yeah.
And I know that America too, Buddhism in America is a relatively new thing. What is it like to start not just a Buddhist thing, but a Tendai Buddhist organization out there in the Berkshire Mountains, where maybe someone might think of Buddhism as just Zen, and like Zen's what it is, but you're
Right.
starting something a little bit more specific. What was it like to ground that where you are?
Well, it was an interesting process because when we started, um, we were just starting it to be a village temple. That's all we intended to do. We were just going to be a village temple. And the original name of the corporate entity is Karuna Tendai Dharma Center. And that was on the sign. We changed it because people kept wondering when we have theatrical gatherings, because they read it as drama center. I said we have to be a little bit more specific about what we are. Nobody knows what Karuna, nobody knows Tendai, so, and it's a drama center. So that's when it became Tendai Buddhist Institute. and but I think to answer your question, we were just interested in starting a small village temple. That was it, to sort of be of service into the community, but as a village temple. And then after we had been here and we'd been functioning for about 5 years, Tendai in Japan sent a group of people from the Jigodan, the Tendai International Charitable Foundation, to visit us. And they liked what we were doing so much that they asked us to be the Betsuin, which is a branch of the main temple, on Enryakuji on Hiei. And so at that point, I had to go for some more advanced training in Japan, and that's in which I did in subsequent years. But originally, we didn't have our vision of being anything more than just a small little village temple. And our mission statement was very simple, just to spread the idea of the Dharma in a very specifically Tendai fashion, but and in a legitimately recognized Tendai way. And our attitude was, we hope that people like it, and we hope that it serves a purpose. We had no idea that it was going to grow to be something larger than that. So it was just from a very humble notion. And it was Tendai Shu itself that felt that what we were doing was, that took a little bit more getting used to. And I think it's interesting, and I'll just share this because I think it says something about American Buddhism in general. When we became the Betsuin and then Tendai, the Jigodan provided the funds for us to renovate a horse barn into the building that serves as our temple today. Previous to that, we had literally been meeting in the horse barn, but in one area where the stalls were, and we just cleaned it up and put up a wall between that area and the other area, and it was, I used to refer to it as Spanky's Clubhouse Zendo. It's that's sort of what it looked like. And all of a sudden now we have this more formal relationship. Now that's the head temple for North America. I have a position within Tendai Shu, etc. That took some getting used to because that was never on my. I didn't imagine that was going to happen. I thought I was just going to be a local village priest serving a function, and let's let's hope that people get something from it. To a point where now, we have other Tendai sanghas around the country in Canada, Puerto Rico, other places, et cetera, et cetera. And so getting used, I think that what it took some getting used to was the idea that now I have a responsibility for something that I didn't anticipate needing to be responsible for, you know. And when we first came back, I recognized that, when you're an academic, it's sort of by being itinerant until you get tenure, because you go to where the jobs are, not you can't just apply to the local university or college. But I was really fortunate because even though I'd been a hospice chaplain, that's how I first earned a living when we got here, as a hospice chaplain, and doing some other things. My wife at the time was doing interpreting from Japan and translation. She would fly to California to do translations and such. When it just so happened that the University of Albany needed a medical anthropologist, and they needed it now. So I was there. And then later on, Simon's Rock at Bard College at Simon's Rock, a local smaller liberal arts college, really found somebody that they needed to hire to teach Japanese. And then they thought, oh, you're also a medical anthropologist. Okay, we need some of that. And so then I switched over to there. In other words, things fell into place. It wasn't so much that I had a vision of here's what we're going to do. It's let's start with a village, and then other things fell into place around it. It worked. That's the way it worked out, which is what I refer to as karma. You know?
Yeah, yeah. And then also this position where the institute is. I mean, that I don't know how things, these kind of energies inform or
Oh,
reflect.
I
Yeah.
think they do. I think they
Yeah.
do.
Yeah.
I think about some of the people who come here, regular Sangha members, who come here, and I kid about the fact that we had every Wednesday evening we have a discussion followed by the gongyo and a meditation service, and then followed by a potluck dinner. Why potluck dinner? You're in New England. You can't have a religious ceremony without a potluck dinner. That's just the nature of the beast. But that becomes really part of the Sangha. I mean, that's the way people get to know each other in a very real way. They know your job, they know whether you're schooled, they know whether your kid is a good kid or having trouble, et cetera, et cetera. And so I kid about the fact, well, we have some intellectual Buddhists, we have some really sincere practitioners, and we have gastronomic Buddhists. And some of them overlap, but some of them don't. Some of them I think come just because of the community, and some of them only because of the meditation. Although I think everybody after a time gets something from all elements of it. But what I was going to say earlier is that when you think about when people first come here, one of the first things that strikes them is how peaceful the place is. In other words, they're coming from wherever they're coming from, and all of a sudden they're here, and it's like they'll tell you it's like the air is fresher or something. But is the air fresher here than down the road 10 miles? Not really. It's the same air. But that's their feeling, is because of the location, because of, I think, the fact that we took a 250-year-old horse barn as opposed to just put up a new structure. I think that all those things work in. And I think the other aspect is, you know, probably the way that we're different from Tendai Temple in Japan is that there is all of the baggage that Japanese Buddhism has to deal with, including the Meiji Restoration, during which Buddhism was persecuted in Japan. And so there's the history up until the Meiji, and then there's a history between the Meiji and the Taisho era in the 1920s, and then the war, and then after. And they really represent, in a short time, different aspects of Japanese culture. But what that means is that there's the expectations the Japanese have of the temple. There's the expectations that the priest has of the temple. And then there's how do those expectations work in with the setting. I mean, you can't go to Hiei or to Kamakura or places like that in Japan, Kyoto in general, and not feel a sense of sacrality. But at the same time, there's the baggage that Buddhism has that Americans don't carry with them about Buddhism. And so in Japan, as a priest, I have to have a much more formal relationship with the Danka. In Japan, it's not a Sangha, it's a Danka. I have to have a more formal relationship with the Danka. Here, I don't have to have that formal relationship. I can relate to people on a peer basis. So there's not the distinction between the ordained and the laity that there would be in Japan, which I think becomes today. At one time, it probably served a very real purpose, but today I think it hinders the ability of the priest to convey the foundations of Buddhism, and it becomes a hindrance for the layperson to hear what the priest has to say. Here, I don't have those hindrances because people are coming. Now, they may have been exposed to a Zen mountain monastery or a Daibuzatsu Zendo or a Green Gulch or whatever, but so the expectations are going to vary, but within that, I have greater latitude to be able to present the teachings in a way that resonates with them, as opposed to a way that's been done for the last 1,200 years. I think that's one of the real advantages.
Yeah, you have such a truly remarkable relationship to it all, where you you have a Buddhist community in the Berkshire Mountains, and you are someone that is, having these more peer relationships with your Sangha, and you can kind of have a closeness to it, and yet you also are someone that is responsible for a Betsuin. You
Right.
that there's a formal tie that you have to acknowledge and maintain and sustain, that connects to Mount Hiei. And there is an entirely different kind of cultural relationship and historical relationship that you have to maintain simultaneously in the same space. And it's a very, to me, I mean, I don't know everything, but it feels like a very unique position that you're in, where you're serving a community that more or less doesn't have this baggage that you're talking about, these
Right.
historical qualities or cultural qualities, and yet you do also have to maintain the grounds or the space and the integrity of what you're teaching and providing, that ties directly back to something that is deeply formal and deeply has its own cultural context. Um, and
And I hear, if you don't mind my interrupting, I
please,
want to
please.
maintain, I think that one of the things that makes our relationship with Tendai Shu in Japan and here a little bit different, knowing other schools of Buddhism and how they operate and that sort of thing, is within Nichiren Buddhism, within Pure Land Buddhism, or at least Shinshu Buddhism, Buddhist Church of America, and even some of the formal Zen schools, Soto Zen. I mean, places like Zen Mountain Monastery never has that kind of relationship with Japan. It was Maezumi Roshi was something of a rebel, but or a maverick may be a better term. But the point is that Tendai Shu has within it an ability to look at me and say, we trust what you're going to do. We know it's going to be different. Do what you think is best. And I look at some of these other schools and you don't see that. They say, no, here's how we do it. you've got to do it that way. And it's not to say they don't, the individual priests don't make some adaptations, but Tendai Shu is totally open to saying, look, you're successful. What you're doing is totally legitimate. We know what you're teaching. We know you're teaching what we teach. We know that, you might teach it differently, but it's the same stuff. And when it comes to meditation, hey, I'd been a Zen practitioner for 20 plus years. We're going to tell you now how to lead your meditations? No, you know what you're doing. But the point is that I see certain other schools, and the local school in America often doesn't have the kind of flexibility that I was given. And so I think that that is somewhat unique in of Buddhism in America,
Yeah.
where they just say, and they're more than willing to say, hey, maybe we should try that, which I think is also you don't see in Japan, or see it very seldom in Japan. And
Yeah.
so I know that there are temples in Japan now that follow some of the same things that we do. Uh, Interestingly enough, it's probably been 15, 20 years now. And I got a call from Hiei one day. And my wife and I are on the within the international division of the Shimucho, which is the administrative offices in Hiei. And I got a telephone call, and they said, we're talking to Ichishima Sensei. We've been asked now to host some weddings on Hiei. You've got to realize that Buddhists traditionally did not do weddings in Japan. That was a Shinto process. But now there's some people who want to do weddings, and they want them done in English. Well, to begin with, there are weddings, there are Buddhist weddings for priests, but that's different than a Buddhist wedding for lay folks. So they said, would you send us your wedding in Japanese and in English? That's what we're going to use.
Wow.
I cannot imagine another school of Buddhism in Japan doing that.
No.
So it shows you to a certain extent the degree to which Tendai Shu is more flexible and willing to entertain the ideas that we don't have to do it always the way we used to. They've got this 1200-year-old history from which Sota Zen came out, Rinzai Zen came out, Pure Land, New Pure Land, Nichiren came out, all these other schools, and yet they're still in a position today of saying, hey, if you're doing it the right way, let us know what you're doing. We'll try it. You know
Yeah.
that I find that to be somewhat unique.
Certainly. And there is something very interesting about what you were just saying, which is this that Tendai has this foundation from which a lot of other uh, very, varying in popularity traditions and schools have spoked off of. You have
Mhm.
Nichiren and all these other uh, prominent figures that came from training in this tradition,
Right,
and through their own interpretations or however it started to coalesce, they founded their own traditions and founded their own schools and moved in a different direction, or maybe continued an aspect of Tendai
right,
forward.
right,
And it is interesting that there's a flexibility from the source where that you might not always find a flexibility in other reflections of it when it kind of spoked out into these different traditions. And when you are, and from what I understand, that there is with the Tendai Buddhist Institute, there is a relationship with the Sangha, or with lay people, where you might be able to meet or consult with people on an individual level and help them engage with their practice to that would kind of bespoke to them, that would serve
right.
them the best. Um, what has that experience been like when you are, on the one hand, serving a temple in Japan and maybe doing more or less some of that there, and then when you are dealing with more of an American sangha, wh- what are you finding, if any differences in what people mostly are gravitating towards to help serve their practice and to develop it?
I think it comes from the distinction in worldview. In Japan, the worldview is Buddhist and Shinto, and then the allied Taoist and Confucian that goes along with that, as well as local practices that developed along the way. In the U.S., the people who are coming here are coming from a Judeo-Christian worldview for the most part. There are some, there's very few, but I have some people who've been Buddhists their entire lives. But so I think that the distinction is that in Japan, when people would come for assistance, whether it was a practice or a personal issue, and people did, for both, the way that you undertake the instruction for that is very different than the way you undertake it here. Here, it's more in the context of pastoral counseling and a form of mentoring, as opposed to that more formalized view in Japan, you know. And switching back and forth is not always easy. It takes it, and also I've evolved over time through this. I haven't been static. In other words, coming from Japan, I did have some very Japanese ideas about how to do some things, and I had to adapt and alter them and recognize, no, that's not the worldview of this person, that here. And so therefore I'm going to have to present it in a way that's understandable in that context. And so I think that I think understanding the worldview of the individual is really important. And I think that in Japan, which is a really very homogeneous population, they make certain assumptions about who they are and who you are and how you're going to respond, and that limits you in your response. Here, there's a different set of expectations and a different set of understandings, but it's not uniform, it's not homogeneous. I think that's one of the differences. In Japan, it's more or less homogeneous. Here, one person may have been raised in an Orthodox Jewish household, and somebody else may have been raised in a Roman Catholic, and another person, we have a number of members here now who were never affiliated with any particular tradition. So it's all new. And then other people, there's a couple of members who had been Franciscan brothers, and other people who are Jewish, So that offers an opportunity, but I had to grow into that. That's not something that sort of came natural. I mean, as an anthropologist, I could recognize it, but how do you actualize it is very different, and how you go about doing that.
Yeah. And I appreciate your ability to like not be the static person, that you can bring what you learned in Japan and more or less over time kind of start to change yourself, but also allow for some difference in the people that you're talking to, and to
Right.
to to set the expectations down of what those old tools were for, and like kind of meet someone where they're at, because after all, that's the idea, right? It's like you're trying to help somebody else along their way, and you can't do that. You can't just apply tools that aren't meant for this culture or this individual. It would just maybe lead to some tension or some friction, or just wouldn't take anyway. And uh, have you found that doing some of the more uh, doing some of these ritual performances with people that are from different backgrounds and have other religious contexts, that there is any trepidation as far as like engaging with ritual, or are they more or less, because they're there, they found themselves there, that they are their game, and that
I,
there's not. Mhm.
I think it runs a gamut. Some people say, I was raised a very strict Roman Catholic or Orthodox Jew, and the ritual feels reassuring to me. Some people say the ritual feels reassuring. It's in a different language or languages, and it doesn't really resemble what it resembles in some ways, but not in all ways what I'd done. But it feels reassuring. And then there's other people who say, I just don't get it, why? But I try to present it as the ritual. If you can get into the ritual, then that enhances your meditation. And the meditation will then permit you to open yourself to the ritual. That it's a they go together. They're not two separate functions. And so when people begin to see it in that way, they can accept it. Now, that's not to say that, we do a Goma ritual, the fire ritual, approximately once a year. And there are people that will leave and they'll say to me, I don't get why I'm watching this, 1500-year-old ritual taking place, this medieval Japanese ritual taking place. Why am I doing this? They'll still show up and they'll still participate, but they'll still be scratching their head, and I'll explain to them, why we do it and all that. But there's still some people who scratch their head, but they'll do it anyway. And then there's other people who just find it incredibly enabling. They find it something about it not only attracts them, but they find to be reassuring. That so but even just the weekly ritual, or it's actually the daily ritual. We do it, for the Sangha as a whole, once a week. Even at that time, they people will say to me, when I first started doing this, I had no idea what the hell I was doing, and I didn't know why I was doing it. But now that I've been doing it for 2 years, I can't sit meditation without it. So it's something that you learn to draw from over time. And there's some people that just say, I'm not into ritual, and you'll never see them again. They'll come one time and say, ritual's useless. That's it, Been there, done that. But then there's other people who will come and they'll participate in the ritual and they'll say, wow, I've never done anything like this, but somehow it feels right. So it's an individual thing.
Yeah. And I appreciate that you appreciate that, where it's really, it can run the gamut, and all of that's okay, whether you come over once, you see the fire ritual and that is a total turn off. That's like, absolutely, I hope you
Right.
find whatever it is that that
Yep.
helps you, however you might find it or seek it. And then there are some people that feel very deepened by it, and I like that description of ritual as being in relation to meditation. It is,
Right.
they inform each other, and there's and there's a necessary link to it, and how one informs the other, and can help benefit and deepen the other. And I found that too, because I for my practice, I sit Soto Zen, and I know that I can sit Zazen in my home. That's more or less, just with timing stuff, is more or less how I manifest my practice. But I try to attend a temple service weekly, if not, sooner, or more or less. And there is something about chanting, and there is something about watching the abbot perform the service, and hearing the bells and the smell of
Hmm.
the incense. There's something about that for me as an individual, that it helps deepen and pervades even when I come home and do my zazen
Sure.
again. It does
Well, and,
something to
and
me.
then there's just the difference between sitting by yourself and sitting with a group of people. I mean, that's such a different experience, and you can't, if you're going to sit with a group of people, um, the energy, and people say, well, what is it? And I say, it's the energy. It's the energy of the people who are sitting there, plain and simple. It's your energy and their energy are mixing in a way that it's not going to happen when you're doing it by yourself. That's not to say you shouldn't be sitting by yourself, but to say it's a different experience.
Certainly, certainly. And it's also a test too, because sometimes I find myself like, yeah, I can nod off at home, and there's no consequence. But if I'm nodding
Right.
off I'm like, oh, wait.
Here comes a
Yeah,
Kyosaku.
yeah. Um, well, this has been such a wonderful conversation. I really enjoyed talking to you, and I just have two more kind of more open questions, if that's all right.
Sure.
One of them is, if you have anything, whether it's a cause or a foundation, that you'd like to promote, or just kind of, or maybe it's something you're working on or writing about, or a function that happens at the Tendai Buddhist Institute that you'd want people to know about, or otherwise, it's really anything that you'd want to share with people to get more attention towards it. And then also too, if there's anything advice wise that you'd want to give to somebody as they're walking in the Buddhist path that you would have wanted to have heard as you were kind of coming up through it at
Mhm.
any point in time. Yeah.
Well, the first one might surprise you a bit, and that is that there was a person who was the founder of the Hizmet movement, which is a Turkish movement founded by Fethullah Gulen. Fethullah Gulen was a Turk. He was the person who was charged by Erdogan, the president of Turkey, a number of years ago, as causing the coup in Turkey, and he had assisted Erdogan in being elected, and then they had a falling out when Gulen felt that corruption was creeping into the government. Well, he died recently, and I feel that there's something that we look at around the world, and I was asked to give a couple of talks on this recently because of his death. I was in Japan at the time, and they had sent me an email asking me to send a video message to his family, which I had done, and then I was asked to do a couple of talks. And the point that I want to make is here is an individual. It's not about Tendai Buddhist Institute. It's not about Buddhism. It's about a movement in which Fethullah Gulen had started, or his followers had started in his name years, starting in the 1980s, 90s. They had started hundreds and hundreds of schools in Africa, South America, South Asia. He's Muslim, he's Sufi, he was, I should say, he's now deceased. And we fascinate ourselves with superheroes, Marvel Comics, Dell, which universe are you a part of, sort of thing. And we look at these superheroes, and then we read something like the Vimalakirti Sutra, in which Vimalakirti is a kind of superhero. He did magical things, so to speak. You've got a person like Fethullah Gulen who had millions of followers. There were 20,000 people at his funeral, to give you an idea, and started hundreds of schools in which men and women could get an education equally. He was a very conservative Muslim scholar, but insisted that men and women were equal in that respect. And conservatives, most of the women within that movement wear jihad, but the idea that we have people walking among us who are bodhisattvas, and you don't have to be a Buddha to be a bodhisattva. You just have to recognize the nature of awakening and to assist others in doing the same. And so you have somebody like Fethullah Gulen who lived, worked, and did work that I think is like a superhero. We're watching films about superheroes when we have bodhisattvas walking the earth, and we have to recognize that. And that is a sense of hopefulness that they're going to be there regardless of who's elected president, regardless of what's going on in the rest of the world. They're still going to be doing their thing. And so the message that I have is not so much what Tendai Buddhist Institute is or is not doing, but just to recognize that we have these people who have a sacred presence around us. We have a kind of responsibility to tune into that and be of assistance to them. We're ignoring, because of our fascination with celebrities and other reasons, we're ignoring all these bodhisattvas. And people should find the bodhisattva that is in their neighborhood, so to speak, and work with them, because awakening is not about what one finds within oneself, but what there is that aspect to it. But also awakening is in the service that we do for others. You cannot have Anuttara Anyaksambodhi without service to others. And so one of the things that I would say is your practice is not your practice. Your practice is everyone, all sentient beings' practice. And that's how we should engage the world, not in terms of what I'm going to do, but what we're going to do for others. That was the first. What was the second question?
I mean, that was amazing. But the second one was advice. Like, what would be some advice that you'd want to give to somebody along the way?
Oh, the advice is to recognize that a specific meditation is not for everyone. That recognize that, and this is really from a Tendai perspective, recognizes that there are many practices that lead to awakening. Meditation is one of many. It could be calligraphy, it could be chanting, it could be esoteric practices, it could be recognize that not every activity is an activity that leads to awakening, but there are activities which we have identified which do, and that Chigi in the Japanese said that there are four types of meditation: sitting only, standing only, both sitting and standing, neither sitting nor standing. Those are the four types of meditation. And recognize that, as an advice, that people should start with the meditation, but then recognize that that practice can grow into something else. You might go back to the meditation, you might then expand the calligraphy or whatever it is. And so when it comes to practice, I want people to think about practice is, how do we seek awakening? How do we become better human beings? And how do we assist others? And the ultimate Buddhist practice is karuna, compassion. The ultimate practice is not meditation or calligraphy or anything of that nature. It's how do we live our lives in a compassionate way, filled with wisdom, advised by upaya, skillful means. That would be it.
Thank you so much, Reverend Monshin. Thank you so much. Those are really both questions you answered in such a it was just beautifully put both times. So thank you for doing that, and thank you
Thank
also
you.
for being a part of this project. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.